Hello and welcome to The Purpose Pursuit, a podcast hosted by me, Hannah Miller. I'm really excited to tell you that you're about to listen to a really useful, interesting conversation with Amy Sandler. Amy Sandler is the principal coach for Radical Candor. Radical Candor is a brilliant, brilliant book by Kim Scott. And Amy chats to me through the concept of radical candor, why we don't always make good choices around caring personally and challenging directly, what it feels like when we dip into ruinous empathy or manipulative insincerity or obnoxious aggression. And together we talk about how we can have those meaningful conversations where we're directly truthful about what's going on, giving feedback, giving praise, giving developmental feedback, and supporting people to their growth without compromising on care or challenge. Amy is an absolute mine of information and experience. She has had some very interesting jobs. She's also a six-time firewalker, and she's a certified teacher of Search Inside Yourself. Amy is absolutely fantastic, and I wish I'd had longer to talk to her. So I really hope you enjoy. If you want to find out more, there will be notes in the show notes. Thanks. So it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Amy. Amy, thank you so much for coming on the Purpose Pursuit podcast. You'll do a better job than me. Can you just give a little bit of context to everyone of your involvement with the work of Radical Candor and how you got there in the first place?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, Hannah. I'm always excited to talk about radical candor and to share with leaders like you who are committed to making the world a more purposeful and better place. So I have been working at Radical Candor. We are now in 2025. So it is coming on 8 years. I started working with Kim Scott, who wrote the book. Kim and I actually went to business school together, but I didn't know Kim during business school. And probably about 5 or 6 years before the book Radical Candor came out, we were introduced because of mutual friends and work that we were doing together with a CEO leadership organization. And she knew that I had been teaching mindfulness to CEOs, teaching emotional intelligence. And so when her book, not even when Radical Candor came out, in fact, she did a kind of viral talk at a place called First Round. And all of a sudden, Silicon Valley being Silicon Valley, people started saying, hey, start a company and here's money, et cetera. And so when she was looking for coaches to deliver Radical Candor, she thought of me. And so that was about 8 years ago or so. And I think what's so interesting, the reason I share some of the details of that story, especially for your listeners who might be going through transitions either in terms of work or networking, et cetera, is just those relationships that we build and how we show up. You and I were also talking about Vistage
Yes.
as a CEO networking organization, education organization. I'd worked there, and it's always a lot easier, I think, to tell the story looking backwards of how the dots connect, but you might not know it in the moment. And so I would just say those relationships that you have been building over time can blossom and come to bear fruit. And so I hope that's an encouraging story of just how friends and networks sort of come together. And Kim was incredibly generous and resourceful and helpful in bringing me on to Radical Candor.
Well, I'm so glad she did because I'm so excited to have the chance to talk to you about all of this today. And the book is actually up there with one of the best books around work and personal development I've read in a long time. My husband is also reading it and squirreling through the whole, making notes. He's highlighted all over it. And I think the reason I would want to so unequivocally recommend it is because the book is full of so much practical wisdom. I find
Yeah.
so many books like this. You have a chapter or two where you think, I've probably got everything I can from this book, and it's been filled out into a book. And as I've gone through the book, it's almost like several books in one, I would say. Each of the chunks could have been developed into books of their own. So there's so much in there for people to take away and think, actually, I can implement the stuff in here and really make a difference to my practice, not just at work, because it talks about being a kick-ass boss, but I actually think it's principles for all of our life, isn't it? Can
Yes.
you, if you'll do a better job than me of this, but I would love it if we could summarize the core message of Radical Candor, first of all, and then perhaps we can get into the two key areas of the two axes of the quadrant, and then the four parts of the quadrant. So, can you give us a summary, first of all, of kind of contextualize it?
Yeah. And so to your point, I mean, the book was written, be a kick-ass boss at work without losing your humanity. So very much towards managers needing to really lay their power down. But to your point, this is about people. It's about building relationships where we care about the people that we work with. Or in relationship with. At the same time, we are being willing to challenge them directly. The reason we call it radical is because it's rare. It's rare that we tend to do both at the same time. What happens is, and you talked about the different dimensions. So if you think about kind of care personally and challenge directly, one of the best ways to illustrate what radical candor is, we like to tell a lot of stories. I knew going to film school would eventually pay off in my career. And so, storytelling is a big part of, I think, why Kim's book is so important. It's her own stories from Google and from Twitter and Apple and all of these places, sort of the best of wisdom from leaders, but also hearing other people's stories. And then to your point about practical tips. So if like, I could certainly share, a couple of stories about what radical candor looks like. And I think it's also important to think about the mistakes we make when we're not practicing radical candor. So if you want, I can start with a mistake, or I can start with what it looks like. What feels interesting for you right now?
Why don't we start with what radical candor looks like? A little bit more around those two things coming together, caring personally and challenging directly. Tell us about what happens when we're getting to do that regularly, and what it looks like.
Yeah, radical candor is really all about painting a picture of what good looks like. And so, I'll share a story of time in my career when I'd recently graduated from Harvard Business School. So I thought I was the greatest thing that had ever, come into the management world. I had a little to learn about humility. And we just launched this new website. This was before, so much tech to make website development easier. And after a lot of delays, we finally launched the website, had a great meeting with the CEO and the CFO. After the meeting, my boss, who was the chief marketing officer, he pointed out to me that in that meeting, I was so focused on the CEO and the CFO that I was ignoring my team. And not only was I ignoring my team, I interrupted one member of the team, and one of them I didn't even let speak. And I was pretty oblivious to the fact that that had happened in the meeting, because I was kind of laser focused on having a good meeting with the quote, most important people in the room. And when he shared that feedback with me, he did a couple of things. He said, Amy, I know how much you care. I know how competitive you are. I love that about you. And I know you can be a great manager, but a great manager lets their people shine. And so he was painting a picture for me of what was possible. He also, in that conversation, gave me the examples of the behavior that I had done. So when one team member was speaking, I had interrupted. When the other team member was speaking, I didn't even let them talk. So he was very specific about what had happened. And I think it's, as we go through the conversation, I'll get into some of the nitty gritty and how to roll it out. But when he specifically told me about the behavior, in the meeting, that's sort of the context, what was observed, when you interrupted your team. So that was the observation. He wasn't saying you're a terrible person, you're a terrible manager. He was just observing what happened. And then what was the result? Like, why is what he's saying matters? Well, the result is I lost the credibility of the team. And I think when we are giving feedback, whether it's criticism, like the story I'm talking about, or praise, which is even more important, why does this matter to the person you're talking to? And have you really thought through that? Are you doing this to be helpful because you're invested in their success? And then we discussed a next step, and he said, go check in on them and, apologize and share that you realized that you had really been stepping on their toes. So in the conversation itself, we want to have feedback, whether it's praise or criticism, that's specific and sincere. But I also want to spend a little bit of time on what I mean by care personally and challenge directly, because
Yes, please
I think
do.
that's
Yeah.
really important. So when we talk about care personally, there were some ways that he showed he cared in the actual conversation that we were having. So he acknowledged the things that had gone really well in the meeting. He acknowledged all the hard work, and he was very authentic. We have pretty good BS meters, right? And so, he was really authentic. And I knew that, it would have been a lot easier for him not to give me this feedback. He knows I'm very sensitive. He knows I'm very hard on myself. And so even though it was a little more than a little hard to hear in the moment,
Mm.
it was a real gift, because had he not told me, I might have lost my team down the road. I was making a big mistake that I was not aware of. And so that challenge, check in with your team, follow up with your team, was both clear, but it was also an act in service of my growth. So in the conversation itself, there was care and challenge. I think what's also important for your listeners to really think about: how am I building relationships with the people that work with me, work for me, that I work for, sort of investments in the bank, deposits in the relationship bank.
Yeah.
And so when I
Yeah.
talk about care personally, and look, this is going to look different for different people. So for me, a couple of the things that this person did, one of them was, I was one of the first 30 people to be selected to be certified for a program out of Google called Search Inside Yourself. You might have heard of it. It's a mindfulness-based emotional intelligence program. And at the time, this was over 10 years ago, mindfulness was not a thing. The
Mm.
company didn't want to invest in it. But he found budget because he knew how important it was for me and my growth.
Mm.
And there were a bunch of other things that he did. A very heavy door fell on me when I was traveling. He literally stayed on the phone with me all night. I had a concussion. But it
Mm.
were so many of these things that showed me he saw me for who I was, for what mattered to me. He was invested in my success, and he wasn't afraid. Well, he may have been afraid to tell me the hard thing, but he still did it because he
Yeah.
knew I needed to hear that in order to be the best possible, in this case, manager that I could be.
And I imagine, as hard as it was in that moment, your respect for him, because of the deposits in the bank already, because of the relationship you had, your respect for him to care enough to give you full feedback, and both the things you did well, but also specifically what you did, the impact it had, the results down the road that could come from that. As we stop and speak rationally about it, we can see nothing but good in that interaction. In the moment, though, it sometimes feels really hard to hear and
Oh,
give, doesn't it? Both ways.
both ways, both ways. And I think one of the things that, Kim Scott, who wrote the book, did that I thought was so brilliant was looking at the mistakes that we make so often, multiple times a day, when we're not practicing radical candor, because you think, oh, it's this really simple idea, care and challenge. How hard can that be?
Hmm.
And so for me, I teach radical candor to hold myself accountable to practicing it, because in many ways it kind of goes against norms that we've had. One norm, what makes it hard to sort of show care about people? You think, well, we don't go into the work world because we don't care. No, we do care, but what gets in the way? Well, we could feel stressed. Maybe we're under a deadline. There's a promotion that we really want to get. We're worried about money. We're exhausted. But I think there's something even deeper. And many of us, when we were, whether 18, 19, even younger, got some message of, don't take it personally, or we're sort of supposed to leave the human parts of ourselves at home. And we get this message to show up at work like some kind of robot. And we're
Mm.
not going to build the kinds of relationships that we need to really thrive and succeed at work if we don't bring that humanity to work. So that's kind of one thing that makes it hard on care personally, is because those messages. And I think that's changing. I do think generationally that's changing. There's more
Yeah.
understanding, especially with what everyone's been through the past few years. Challenge directly comes at an even, younger age, which is, and I'm curious if you got this and if your listeners did, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say
Don't
anything
say
at all,
anything.
right? And so we're going, that's, more like 18 months old, and it comes from a really good place, right? Like we're wired to belong. But if you are at work, and especially if you're a leader, it really is not just your job to say the hard thing, but an obligation. And
Mm.
so I think, and also when you think about building trust with people, you know, for me, this is really what's underneath all of this is when you think about the people that you really trust, that if you are messing up, that you would trust they were telling you, and they're pointing out all the things you're doing well. I'll tell you just a quick story if to illuminate this. We have a partnership with Second City Works. Are you familiar with Second City? In the US, they're like a big improvisation group. I know there's a lot of
Okay.
great improv in the UK. And so I was leading a session on Radical Candor with some improvisers, you know, very
Mm.
funny people. And one of them, I just met him. He came out of, we would call it the bathroom or the restroom. I guess you'd call it the loo. And his fly was down. His zipper was down. And we're about to go on stage. My first response in my head is, who's going to tell this guy that his fly is down?
Mm.
You know, it's like, it's not going to be me. And then I'm like, Amy, first of all, you're teaching radical candor. Second of all, there is literally no one between this guy and the
It's you
stage.
or
It's me. Like
nobody.
it's all on me. So I pulled him to the side. I told him, and of course he was hilarious about it because he was an improviser. But I share that because our tendency is someone else is going to tell them, they'll figure it out, right? And so when we do improv, we say to each other, got your back. Because if you're going to go on stage, you have to trust that this other person is looking out for you. And I think in any kind of, you know, work relationship, other relationship, that sense of these people have my back, that's where trust comes from.
And this is a sideways, but I'm just thinking about these two areas of challenging directly and caring personally. And before we go into where this goes wrong in a minute, I was just reflecting on so many of my listeners are also parents. And I'm a parent. I've got a 16-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 21-year-old. And I'm thinking that actually this care personally, challenge directly, and you obviously it's love wholeheartedly, but also challenge directly when you're a parent, that sometimes we can also fall out of those two areas in that role of our life where actually we have a responsibility. If you care enough, you are responsible for these little human beings and giving them feedback on what they're doing really well and challenging them to grow in that area, but also actually that wasn't okay and this is why not. And somewhere along the line, sometimes the messages around parenting can fall into these other areas that we're going to talk about here as well, and we can fall into the trap of, I don't want to say them because I want to give you a chance to explain them, but the areas of the four-way matrix that are not radical candor. So although we're talking about working relationships and being able to lead people or be effective in that place, this is so integral to the key relationships we have in our life as well.
Absolutely. It's universal. I don't have kids. Kim does have twins, and she will often say that nobody wants to give you feedback except your kids. So I think, you know, she calls it the house of radical candor, but
Oh, my
absolutely,
children
you
are
know,
radically candor. Yeah, they give
yeah,
me
yeah.
plenty
We could talk
feedback.
about that dynamic and if that is radically candid feedback that is being provided. But yeah, I think what the reason why this resonates so much is because I think Kim has this beautiful ability to distill, you know, complex human dynamics in a simple way. And I'll talk about the framework because I think it's a very helpful mental model for any conversation that we might have. So if you could imagine sort of a vertical axis, which we would call care personally, and a horizontal axis. So it does create sort of like a 2x2 framework like you're talking about. So at the top right would be radical candor. We're caring and we're challenging. The bottom right is we're challenging, but we're not caring. And we call that obnoxious aggression. And this is when, you know, this could be public criticism. The person knows what the problem is, but you have blown up the relationship. So for example, in the story that I shared, if instead of him doing this privately, if he had done it in the middle of the meeting, Amy, your team hates you, pay attention to that. You know, like I would have known what the problem was, but talk about a trust destroyer.
Totally.
Right.
Totally.
And so,
can I just say, so many people listening will be automatically resonating with experiences of being on the receiving end of that, where we've stood there and been publicly criticized, or there's been this lack of trust in the environment, which has meant, I mean, I have been on the receiving end of obnoxious regression from bosses in the past, and just it's so bruising, and it erodes the relationship that you thought you had quite significantly. Even in one scenario, it can have a big difference.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important mentioning that we're coming to this topic of feedback with our own lived experiences and our histories and the sort of emotional resonance around these things. And then you layer in power, and if it's a boss, and then if you layer in underrepresented, whether it's around gender, race, all of these other ways. And so that was why Kim, focused the book on managers, that managers really do need to lay that power down and actually start by soliciting feedback. We'll get into sort of the role of leaders, but I think it's really important when you look at the cost, often in cultures, sometimes that behavior can be rewarded because it's the only other quadrant besides radical candor where people know what the problem is. And then you think about the human cost, and then people start getting more and more quiet and shutting down, et cetera. So there can be a big cost there. And a couple of things to mention about this quadrant. One of them, am I allowed to say a not very nice word on the air here?
Yeah, go for it.
Kim was originally going to call this the asshole quadrant because it seemed, more radically, it seemed more clear, right? But it's really, or the jerk quadrant. The reason why we don't do that, and I think especially, you do so much work around personalities and analysis. This framework is not a personality test.
No.
We can all act like jerks. This is about how can we have our conversations move in a better place? Conversations about behavior and about work products. So, I don't want to be a jerk. I've certainly acted like a jerk.
Yeah,
and where I think this framework can be, yeah, exactly. We've made these mistakes even in one conversation. And so using this framework, I like to say, use it more like a compass to guide individual conversations with individual people to a better place. If we notice, oh gosh, I'm starting to be really challenging here, like, can I be more caring? Can I sort of move up more on care personally? And another thing, if you are someone who struggles with Radical Candor, another thing we did, there's an updated edition of the book, and we introduced the idea of compassionate candor, because sometimes people were misusing that phrase of radical candor. And no, this was not radical candor. This was obnoxious aggression. Like, you can't just do air quotes and say, in the spirit of radical candor, you're an idiot. This is terrible. Yes. No, that is not radical candor. So if that applies to you, think about compassionate candor.
Good. That's really good. I think I want to ask you, as we go into these different quadrants, I really love what you've just said. I think it's so important that we distinguish the difference between, we have a personality and there are things that come more naturally to our personality. Kim covers that so much in the book when she's talking about different types of listening and different types of leading. There's so much in there that means she fully gets that we have different personalities and ways of achieving a goal. But it's so important we separate radical candor from personality. Otherwise, I think it gives people the permission, myself included, to say, oh, well, that's just too difficult for me. It's too difficult for me because of X, Y, Z. And I think, can we talk about ruinous empathy next? So we've talked about obnoxious aggression and how that is the lack of care. But ruinous empathy, I wonder whether some people who are listening to this podcast, so for example, maybe people who've got strengths such as harmony or high empathy, they may think, oh, well, this is just what I'm going to do because I don't want to upset anybody. And so it can almost act as in my world, that would be like an underdeveloped use of that strength. And it's an immature look at that strength. So I'm with you and I agree with you. But can we discuss why some people may have a tendency towards ruinous empathy because of their personality, but that it isn't a personality trait? And what does ruinous empathy look like? When are we doing it?
Yes, well, this is a mistake I certainly know very well and very familiar with. So ruinous empathy, if we're kind of going back to that 2x2 framework, this would be in the top left. So high care, to your point, low challenge. Now, empathy itself is foundational to our practice of radical candor. It becomes ruinous when we care so much about hurting the other person's feelings, we don't tell them what they need to know. So
Like we
going
don't
back
tell
to
them the zipper's down.
100%,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, oh, I don't want to embarrass him.
Mm.
Oh, and now he's gone on stage in front of 500 people because I didn't want to embarrass him by telling it. That's a quick example, an example in the story that I shared. If my boss hadn't told me, oh, Amy's so sensitive, I don't want to tell her, and then my team leaves me. I had a relationship with somebody that worked for me 9 times out of 10. We were actually very good friends as well, and we don't work relationships and friendships, but I really considered this person a good friend. I was the manager. 9 times out of 10 he would go above and beyond, and every so often out of the blue he would get very angry about something.
Right.
And I have a tendency to want to avoid conflict because harmony is at the top of my
Okay, great.
traits there. And so I would give feedback like, oh, I know things are so stressful. I heard that you got upset, but don't worry about it. I know how hard things are. So I was sugarcoating everything. I was not giving any criticism whatsoever. We got a new boss, a new manager came, and I heard, and it was a virtual situation before all of the virtual tools. I heard that he yelled in a meeting and like threw a chair. And I didn't speak to it. I, again, totally avoided it. And this all blew up at an in-person retreat. This new boss had gotten a very well-known, expensive facilitator. We were told to arrive in professional, sort of dressy clothes. He was in shorts. He started yelling in the meeting. My manager stopped the meeting, pulled me outside, and said, you have to say something or he is out.
Mm.
And so I had to have a conversation where I said, this has been going on for months. Your job is on the line. And he said, this is the first time you're telling me.
Yeah.
And I was able to save his job, but not that relationship because the trust was totally blown. And so for me, again, what motivates me to teach radical candor as someone who is highly empathetic,
Mm.
intuitive, et cetera, is because often the kindest thing you can be is clear. The sort of Brene Brown,
Yeah.
clear is
Yeah.
kind. And I
Clear as
am not
kind.
doing this person any favors by worrying so much about the short-term feeling
Mm.
versus what really needs to happen. Now, it doesn't mean that I just start yelling at him, right? I do this in a caring way, but avoiding telling them the thing they need to know for fear of their feelings. That's very often what
Mm.
happens. This story I want to share, it also dips into another quadrant, and I'd love to get your take on it. So the third and sort of worst of all quadrants is what we call manipulative insincerity, which is low
Mm.
care, low challenge. And sometimes we can land here because, to your point, maybe somebody was bullying us, there was obnoxious aggression, so we sort of get into some more self-protective behavior. So I think I just want to name that because that can happen. But this can be sort of either the false apology, oh, I didn't really mean it, or talking about people behind their back, or the sort of meeting after the meeting, right? And so we're talking about people, not to people.
Yeah.
What's very interesting, if you go back to that sort of that vertical line of care personally, ruinous empathy, which is high care, low challenge, which I just told the story about. I was so worried about his feelings, I didn't tell him. Manipulative insincerity, I'm more worried about me. And if I'm really honest with myself, that was also happening in this situation. I didn't want to have the discomfort of that conversation. I wanted everyone to like me. I didn't want to be seen as, the mean boss, et
Mm.
cetera. And
Mm.
so both of those things were true. And I think that idea, we often will call those two quadrants false harmony.
Mm.
So I'm
That's good.
optimizing for harmony, but at the sake of his career, our relationship,
Mm.
to protect my own discomfort around a
Mm.
difficult conversation.
And there's a couple of things I'll pick up on there. First of all, I love like this phrase of false harmony so good because it plays into that idea of actually this is what it looks like when any of our strengths, whether we're talking about strengths such as empathy and harmony, or whether we're talking about self-assurance or significance, whatever the strength might be, actually for it to be in balance in a good place in our life, you could put these principles underneath it of care and challenge. And it's almost like an underdeveloped or an immature or a false version of a strength. If it's not, the phrase I always say to people, it's not a strength, it's not good for you and it's not good for the other person. And so to your point, if harmony or empathy or self-assurance or whatever the strength or personality type is, if it stops you from doing what's good for you and good for them, then it's not operating as a strength. And when I read the book, I felt really challenged by manipulative insincerity and actually realizing that there is a lot of that at play in some of the times I've got it wrong too. And I perhaps thought, I've done it all. Like I'm definitely an all person, but I thought, oh, I know when I get obnoxious, I know that's when I'm under big stress, and that's most likely to happen at home. And I know when I go to ruminous empathy, but actually, I felt quite convicted, if that's the word I can use, of actually my feelings matter, and I am worried what people think of me. I want to be the boss that people like. I want to be the boss that's popular. And there's such a challenge in here that actually leadership doesn't mean that you can't have caring and deep relationships, but you may say and do things that are not popular, like being a parent, if I can just make that equivalence. Yeah. As a parent, it is my job to build a deep relationship, but I am going to be unpopular at times because of the nature of doing that role well. And if I want to just be popular, I'm going to make wrong decisions. And I felt so challenged around that. And it made manipulative insincerity more approachable for me to realize that that's something that I do too. And so I as much as we avoided the jerk language for obnoxious aggression, it's recognizing that we can be gently manipulative when we're preferring what we want best.
Absolutely. And, I think the names of these mistakes, can really, to your point, challenge us. And so if the language, if it's helpful, I always say sort of use it or toss. Like, for example, Kim very intentionally chose challenge directly. And for me, another way into that is clarity. Because, being a harmony person, what's really important here is that, am I being kind and clear? And the way that I like to think about these conversations, does this person at the end of the conversation, do they feel like I care about them, that I'm invested in their success? And do they feel clear about what it is that I'm saying to them? Very often, we'll often say the biggest, sort of the fundamental mistake of communication is the idea that it happened. So often we think that we are being clear and the other person doesn't know what we're talking about. And
I totally agree.
Yeah. And so going even back to the strengths conversation, like for me, care personally comes quite naturally. And one of the really interesting things teaching Radical Candor now for 8 years, and I've had a few different roles, chief content officer, chief marketing officer, and now principal coach, is realizing that there's a bunch of folks out there that the challenge directly is far more natural and needing to build that muscle of care personally. And so I think for all of your listeners, wherever they are, what I have found is we tend to have one or the other that is maybe more natural or more of a strength. For me, it's taken work. How can I be more clear? And really, in service of the other person? Because I think one point that I haven't mentioned yet, Hannah, Radical Candor is measured not at my mouth as the speaker, but at the listener's ear. How is what I'm saying landing for this other person? So I might think I'm being kind and clear with you, but maybe you think I'm being ruinously empathetic. You would like me to be more challenging, and someone else thinks I'm acting like a jerk.
That's really good. And I've got a good example actually of another example of the clarity. Somebody I know very well was in a situation where they needed to, it was going to be to let somebody go actually. They'd been in a probation scenario and they were not going to be kept on. And what might seem like the most kind thing to do in that situation is to have a long meeting where at the end of a long discussion, you then say, and having given you all that feedback, actually, I'm going to tell you that we're not keeping you on. But actually, the person who told me this story said they made a decision that very early in that meeting, that kindly but clearly they would say, the decision has been made that actually we're going to let you go. The meeting didn't end then. Then there was the conversation, the discussion, the next steps. But there wasn't this tenterhooks or I'm going to leave you waiting because I'm just soothing the environment till I'm ready to say it. They actually laid it out quickly, clearly, with there could be no way it was misconstrued. And again, I thought it was a really good example how some of us might, there's a beating around the bush can be a bit of a British thing to do. And I've got I know an Italian person who said, you British, you dance around the pudding. I mean, they made that up. I don't know what that means. But this idea
I like that.
I know I do too. We dance around a pudding, but we beat around the bush. And sometimes we're beating around the bush because we think this is kinder, when actually that I'm going to say clearly what's happened, but I'm not going to leave you there. Then we'll expand. Then we'll push it out. I took a lot from that example myself and thought, what would I have done? I think I probably would have had a tendency to chat and do all the let's talk about the weekend and do all of that first and go, all right, I'm going to segue around to this. I thought that was such a good example of that would have been me preferring myself rather than the other person.
Yeah, that is such a great example. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in what you shared. One thing I think is so helpful, just want to speak about even the cultural differences, because I've taught Radical Candor all around the world. There's certain, cultural differences, whether it's, Italian versus British, et cetera, even in the US, different parts of the country. So I think it's really important to take into account, someone's cultural background, generational background, all of these different ways we can be different or similar. But ultimately, it's a one-on-one conversation. So I'm talking to Hannah, and Hannah is going to be, based on, your upbringing and the culture, all of these things. But I still want to know what Radical Candor is going to look like for you and for me individually. So it brings all of these things in. In fact, I recently did a session with Amazon Japan, and Kim had a team in Japan, and the team didn't like the phrase radical candor. It didn't align with their cultural values, and so they came up with the phrase polite persistence. The polite was the care personally, and the persistence was the challenge directly. And so it could be, I did with that group as an exercise, in your own words, how would you describe radical candor? And that can be a really good exercise. What does care personally look like for you? Oh, they took the time. In the case of a firing conversation, a performance, come to me straight away. Tell me exactly what it is. And I think it's really important when we work with people, what are people's styles? So for example, if I was getting a written performance review that I would then have a conversation with my manager about, I personally like to have that presented ahead of time so I can read it, I can digest it. Any emotions I might have, I've worked through. Kim, on the other hand, she's just throw it at me in the moment, etc. So it's really important to know, what are people's different, how do you like to absorb information, and having it in a real-time feedback conversation. The other thing,
not making the sorry.
Oh no, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, not making the assumption, which I talk about a lot in my work, is don't assume that what you would prefer is what they would prefer. So if you think, oh, I'd love lots of detail, well, they might not. There are principles that are universal, which is what we're talking about here. But then some of the stylistic stuff and the way we like to receive and understand information or prepare, people are really different, and we sometimes fall into the trap of thinking, oh, I definitely wouldn't want any preparation, so I'm not going to give them any. We have to know our people and the people around us as best as we can to make good decisions.
Absolutely. It's such a great point. And, even around emotions as well. So we will have conversations, if people are getting emotional in a conversation. So I'm someone, I like to process, and I'm happy talking about it. I mean, I wouldn't have been this way 20 years ago, but I've done a lot of work. So I'm feeling a strong emotion. Let me just take a few breaths here, and maybe we might need to pause. Kim, she doesn't really like attention being paid to the emotion. She just wants to keep having the conversation. So it can be very helpful with the people that you work with. Hey, if you're having a strong emotion, what would be most helpful for you? Do you want to kind of acknowledge it, talk about it? Do you want to just say, hey, let's pick this up in a few more hours, something like that?
Sorry, give me 1 second. Sorry, she was fast asleep. And don't worry, we'll cut it out. Fast asleep. And normally that doesn't ever, I've lost my little thing. Hold on.
No problem.
He's fast asleep. There's nobody meant to be knocking or doing anything. Sorry about that.
No problem on my end.
Can you go back a tiny bit? You were saying,
sure. I was talking about emotions. We can just take a breath.
Yes, take it from there.
Yeah. No,
you were saying about how you gave the example of you and Kim, and then you went and you embellished that.
Yeah. So I think it can be a very helpful exercise to, with people that you work closely with, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling sad, frustrated, what would be most helpful for you to have those conversations
that's really
before
good.
you get into it. So, oh, for Kim, this would be most helpful. For Amy, this would be most helpful. The other thing I wanted to go back to, Hannah, going back to, was it dancing around the pudding, which is, I just love that. I'm going to take that. Now it's getting me both hungry and I want to go dancing around the pudding. Is we do a lot of, in our workshops. So at Radical Candor, we have, keynotes and workshops, and we do a practice where people will practice role-playing, giving criticism. And often what happens is we see that tendency to kind of beat around the bush, dance around the pudding. And one of the best things when we practice is realizing that is not helpful to the other person. It's our own discomfort. So really having some of that practice, I like to actually write down, what my key points are. So that can be helpful. One thing I just want to make sure we touch on is the importance of soliciting feedback. I know we haven't gotten there yet, so I do want to make sure we cover that too. We have talked more about giving feedback, but I want folks to understand, going back to like, how do I build a more trusting relationship? Is we want to start by asking for feedback. So certainly if we are managers, if we have some power there, we have got to kind of lay the power down by asking for feedback. But even peer-to-peer people that we're working with, it's almost like this, we want this superpower to be able to read people's minds. Well, ask them, what would be the most effective way for me to give you feedback? Tell me about a manager that you appreciated working with. Like what's one thing that they did, explaining your version of Radical Candor. What would Radical Candor look like for them? Even a couple of questions like, what's one thing I did in the last week that made it tough to work with me? Or, one question I really like, Hannah, is for those of us who struggle with micromanaging, like we get all up in the details, can be very helpful to ask someone, in the last week, where did I get involved where you wish I hadn't? Or if somebody actually is more of an absentee manager, where did you actually need me and I wasn't available? So there's questions to kind of solicit feedback, both praise and criticism, but as managers, especially criticism is important. And we also want to make sure we're giving more praise than criticism. We want to be doing this more frequently. One of the biggest mistakes is people kind of think that we just wait to give feedback to an annual performance review. And
totally agree.
Ongoing conversations.
So there aren't surprises in that environment. It's
exactly.
It's around it. I mean, I totally agree with you. A couple of things I want to pick up on what you've said there. It takes a secure person and a secure leader, so that who've done that work on themselves, to be able to say, I want feedback on, tell me how I have helped and how I have hindered. Tell me when I got in the detail or when I wasn't present. And you've got to build the trust and the relationship to be able to have those conversations, haven't you? It needs the hard work being put in. And sometimes people say, oh, I just am so busy, I haven't got time to do this. And I would say, and I would reflect on that myself, that sometimes I let myself get too busy, but it saves so much time in the long run if you do these things in the short run. If you build that relationship so that actually you're like, oh, okay, I've put this legwork in for our relationship to be secure and develop, so that we can go on to have these conversations and cut out a whole load of lost time or wrong roles, wrong people. All the rest of it is going to be more avoided. I think when I've felt more insecure, I haven't wanted that kind of feedback. And when I feel more secure, my closest colleague, Laura, she said to me not that long ago, she said, Hannah, sometimes working for you feels like everything is urgent and I just don't know what's a priority. And I was so appreciative of that feedback. It was radical candor. It was challenging directly, and she cares about me personally. And so I had bandwidth for what she had to say because she'd done a good job. We've done a good job of getting those things in place. I wonder what you'd say to somebody who feels like their excuse or problem is, I just haven't got time to develop their relationships, and so they're just stuck in the urgent box with their relationships with their team or their children or whatever. They're just firefighting almost. Nobody has the monopoly on busyness. Kim worked in a busy company, in a busy place with plenty to do. So what would you say to somebody who's just saying to me, but I'm just juggling so much and I can't do this work on the building relationships as well as I would like to?
Look, I think, especially probably to your audience, people might not only be having, kids you're dealing and older generations and sort of the sandwich generation. So time is certainly a premium. But what I will say is I don't know any relationship that, you has succeeded, like, oh, this is a good employee, I'll just check in on them, every couple months. Like that is not how we build relationships. And I think to your point, as someone who has taught mindfulness, and there's a joke about, if you don't have 10 minutes to practice mindfulness, try 5 minutes. If you don't have 5 minutes to practice mindfulness, try 1 minute. If you don't have 1 minute to practice mindfulness, try an hour. Because it's like if
good.
You can't even get that sort of 1 minute for yourself. I think of, and we've had this even at Radical Candor, the amount of time after these conversations don't happen, of misunderstood intentions. Why are we making this decision? I feel left out. I feel not respected. Think about for yourself the conversations you've had in your head going to bed. And why did they say this? And I should have said it that way. And are they really upset with me? And I'm so upset with them. And just that wasted emotional time and energy and friction. And what I would say is just, these are not like hour-long therapy sessions. The atomic building block of these feedback conversations is sort of 1 to 5 minute conversations that you can bake into, if it's you and me, Hannah, and we're having an hour slot together, we end the podcast at 5 minutes before the hour. We check in, say, hey, Hannah, it was so great working with you. What's one way I could have been a better guest on your show? What's something that worked really well? And so kind of baking that into like how we do things together, it sets the model so that most of the time there's not going to be problem. Oh, it was so great, I really like the story, would have liked a little more time here. Okay, great. If there was a big issue, we've already just sort of baked that in, and so we know it's there. I also like to do it even before I'm going into a meeting, like, Hannah, I'm working on being more succinct in my executive summaries for client calls. So would you mind just taking an eye on how I'm introducing the topic to the client? And at the end of the meeting, just check in, what worked, what couldn't have worked. So it just becomes something like brushing and flossing rather than a root canal. So it just doesn't have to be this big thing. And by the way, again, far more praise than criticism. Let's focus on the good stuff.
And can we talk about praise? Because I talk about this quite a lot, and I would love you. I've got a couple of things I'd love to quick fire with you. And one is around praise. Some people, a couple of points, and I'll let you talk about it. One is I get sometimes people say, well, I don't need praise, or people shouldn't be praised for doing their job. That's one group of people that I would like us to speak to. The other thing I'd like to say is I used to be a teacher, Amy, so my background is teaching. And a big issue for me was, even in that environment, was do not use language like, oh, well done, you were such a superstar. If you're going to give feedback about what's been done well, get specific about it. You can't recreate. If you don't know what it was that was brilliant about a piece of writing, how can you do it again? And I really push hard this message of get specific, tell somebody something about how you can see this being used, how you see this in their future. Say it with generosity of spirit, that actually, again, the more secure you are, the more able you are to give praise away. I'm really passionate about that regularity of praise and specificity, rather than woolly statements that actually can make you feel good, but also feel like, oh, it's great you think this is fantastic, but I'm actually a little bit insecure because I don't quite know what. I worked with one company where all the time they said everyone was amazing. And when I did one-to-ones with staff, they said, we know we're amazing, but we don't really know why. And actually, it didn't breed this sincerity that we're looking for in praise. So could you speak to both those things a little bit? Because challenge directly, it's easy to think it's just about the challenge things, but it's also about challenging growth and speaking praise and life into who people are and what they contribute. So would you speak into that a little bit, Amy?
Absolutely. I mean, fully aligned on what you said. Radical candor is when we're praising is specific and sincere. And we do need praise because we need to know what good looks like.
Yeah.
People, to your point, great job. Like, I don't know what that refers to. You're amazing, not helpful. So going back to the example that I shared, the model we use, we call CORE. It's adapted from, there's a model called SBI from the Center for Creative Leadership. So it's the exact same thing for praise as criticism. So what's the context? So going back to the meeting where I, made the big mistakes, but in the meeting, the observation was when you presented both sides of the argument, that would be a piece of praise. And then again, what is the result? This is where so often praise falls short. Why did it matter? Well, the result was you built credibility. Right. So really thinking through what was the behavior or work product, that one specific work product or behavior, take it out of vague, genius, amazing. What was the observation? What was the result? One result. And then going back to that idea of challenge, to your point, praise isn't care and criticize is challenge. They both have care and challenge. So a challenge for praise could be as simple as keep it up. I'd love to see you do that in the next meeting with the CEO. It could also be kind of minting experts. Amy, I would love for you to show the rest of the team how you built that deck or how you incorporated looking at both sides of the argument. We could learn from you. So it's that continue. Another model around feedback can be start, stop, continue. So it could sort of be that, criticism could be start, stop, praise could be continued. And for me, another mental model, because different things will land with different people, I like to think about praise and criticism. Praise is like putting your foot on the gas. We're going to get where we're going through showing, specific examples of what worked well. Criticism is like putting our foot on the brake. If we just keep putting our foot on the brake, we're not going to get very far. Specific and sincere praise can also build a relationship because it shows us that we're noticing what this other person is doing and we appreciate it. We will often at the end of a workshop have people give each other specific and sincere praise. And in those moments, people realize like there is so much good stuff happening all the time. And by noticing it, then that's how we start to see even more of it. Someone was saying, they sent out a quarterly newsletter for 10 years. Nobody ever mentioned it until that exercise. They said, oh, I look forward to those newsletters, every week. It makes me feel informed. And, so hearing, and people will often value things for different reasons than the reason you do it. And that is another way to build connection.
Thank you. And another specific I want to ask, which is slightly off topic, but it's something that people asked me to ask you. Radical Candor is about colleagues. It's about people that are direct reports, potentially. It's also about having it upward with people. I don't like that language, but you know what I mean. People who are in leadership. What about if you're dealing with somebody? The question was, what about somebody who is fundamentally very difficult, i.e. perhaps narcissistic, and you're trying to have radical candor with them, but they are struggling with the concept. How do we deal with are we responsible for them? What do we do with those kind of highly challenging individuals, not just a bit tricky or, a behavioral trait we'd like to see change, but pretty tricky? What can we do? And what's our responsibility? And how does radical candor fit into that?
It's a great question. I think there's two pieces to your question. One is sort of systemic hierarchical power. And so radical candor does work in all directions. And so, if I am, if I am trying to practice radical candor with my boss, for example, I want to follow our order of operations, any relationship order of operations, which is start by soliciting feedback, be giving more praise than criticism, and then gauge how is what I'm saying landing. So that's kind of thing one, which I would say is that model works whether it's peer to peer. Again, we don't like the hierarchical terms, but that's the reality: upwards, downwards, side. Always start by soliciting feedback. Now, ideally, we're in an organization where everyone is practicing radical candor, and from the CEO down, they're soliciting feedback, they're rewarding the candor. We don't always live in that world. So, there's sort of that one piece. If it is to my manager or my boss and I'm not sure how they're going to respond, I might say something like, I might solicit feedback. So, hey, Hannah, I'm working on this project. I know it's a top priority for me to hit these numbers, and I'd love to know what's one thing I could do so that I can make sure that I'm achieving the metric on my social media postings or whatever it might be. So I might solicit feedback on a specific part of my role. And then I might share, hey, it's working really well, the way that you gave direction on our OKRs this quarter, whatever it might be. When it comes to giving criticism to your boss, you might say, I have observed something that I think could be better on the team. Would you be open to hearing my perspective on that? Right. So just sort of like knowing that they might have a different set of values. Are they open to hearing your perspective? You're doing it to help them, et cetera. So that's kind of thing one of just hierarchy. The other one that you mentioned, which may or may not be about hierarchy, but is really just someone does not seem open to hearing radical candor. And so I would say, first of all, radical candor is a two-way street. It takes two to tango. And I would check in, first of all, have you solicited feedback from this person? Have you been building trust? Have you been rewarding the candor for them? So sort of first looking at my part of this relationship. Do they even understand what you mean by radical candor, right? Because again, that idea that, I think I was being clear, but we don't really know what's happening for that other person. So I'd get very curious, sharing your own experiences. And then I think if this is someone that you really do want to build a relationship, sometimes we might have different, certain people, we might just have a bit of friction there. Might be helpful if there is someone in the organization that does have a good relationship with this person. And, hey, I'd love some advice. I'm looking to build this relationship with this person. So there are a few things that you can start to do sort of for yourself in looking through of, what I might be contributing to it before we choose, what this is someone that I've tried X, I've tried Y, I've tried Z, and now I just feel like, I feel pretty complete on that.
Thank you. And I just want to repeat what you've just said, that model of thinking about soliciting feedback, rewarding, and then thinking about criticism is so good in terms of a way of building in the stepping stones of radical candor. Now, I'm aware of time, and you're a very busy woman who has been unbelievably kind to give this time. We will put in the show notes all the ways people can take this further, like for the book. But could you just tell people about the pod, about things that people can do if they want to take it further? I'm just going to hold this up.
Oh, excellent. Radical Candor, the book by Kim Scott. I am the host of the Radical Candor podcast. So wherever you listen to podcasts, check out the Radical Candor podcast. We've also got a new community where you can interact with other folks around the world who are practicing radical candor. You can go to community.radicalcandor.com. But again, podcast, book, we've got lots of free content available on our website, radicalcandor.com. And Hannah, wonderful questions. It's so exciting. I love how you brought in also, this is not just for work, it's for anywhere you run into people, which is pretty much everywhere. Yeah.
Amy, it's been a real joy to talk to you. Thank you. It's the end of the day on a Friday for me. I know you've got your Friday ahead of you, but end of the day of a Friday for me. And what a great way to finish the working week. So thank you so much for your generosity with the concept and your stories and your wisdom. And I know this is going to resonate with everybody. And they'll probably be like, we would have loved 2 or 3 hours with Amy, but thank you for what we got. I really appreciate it.